Hi, this is Nathan Boone from the Indiana Farmers Union, and I'm a food safety trainer and also a produce grower. And I'm here with Tari Gary from the Safe Produce Indiana to talk about worker training. Tari, why don't you introduce yourself and then I'll ask you a question.
Thanks, Nathan. As Nathan said, my name is Tari Gary. I'm the Food Safety Outreach Coordinator at the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, and I lead outreach efforts for the Safe Produce Indiana program.
Great. So everyone's gone through all the trainings, or hopefully they have. So why are we talking about worker training today?
Worker training is very important on produce farms because most of the time we have people on farms that are helping with harvest activities and handling fresh produce, even post-harvest activities. And we can't just assume that they know what food safety practices they need to follow. Food safety is learned, therefore all of these workers need food safety training to enforce good practices.
Okay, so that makes sense. And you guys have been increasingly visiting and inspecting and helping smaller farms as well as larger farms with their produce safety. So is this an area that you guys are seeing that could use some improvement in Indiana farms?
Yes, and typically we see farms that are hiring help or doing a good job training their workers upon
Mhm.
hire. But sometimes where we're seeing some gaps is on farms where maybe it's family or neighbors or volunteers helping out. And
Sure.
that's something we're trying to drive home is that everyone, if they're handling fresh produce or food contact surfaces, they need training according to the produce safety rule.
Okay, great. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about who needs training. And I can certainly understand when you have, friends and family helping you out on the farm, those relationships might be a little problematic to sit them down and say, hey, I need to train you, Dad, on hygiene or on produce safety. So let's go through this.
Yes, and the requirement, like I said, for the produce safety rule is anyone that's handling fresh produce or food contact surfaces needs training, whether they're doing this every day or one day out of the year, it really doesn't matter. So that could be managers, farm workers, even office staff that help out when you're
Mhm,
shorthanded.
mhm.
Maybe volunteers, interns, family members. We see some farms where they do have volunteers come on the farm, one day a year, and those volunteers will need training before they start handling fresh produce. So it's not just hired help. That's a common misconception, but anyone that is doing those tasks.
Yeah,
And they need to, oh, sorry, go ahead,
no, I
Nathan.
was just gonna say I really like this picture down here of Grandma and Grandpa with the pallet bin there because you just don't know who's going to help you. So that's to your point.
Exactly, 100%. So yeah, they need to be trained how to identify and reduce food safety risks, and how to report those food safety risks when they see them. And the last point on here, owners, managers, and supervisors not only need to do that training with those employees, but they're training even when they're not training. So they must lead by good example and set a good example for those employees because that's what they're watching on the farm to see how to do things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been my experience too, Terry, is that, everyone looks to the main operators, whether that's the farm or the farm family, and how they treat it is how your workers are going to treat it because it's a top-down culture. So I totally agree with that. Let's go to the next slide.
So some things that, so we talked about workers need to be trained to identify and reduce food safety risks. So what exactly do they need to be trained on? And one of those things is to evaluate contamination risks while they're harvesting at harvest. So they're looking for things like signs of animal activity or contamination of produce with animal feces, any damaged crops or extensive animal tracks. All of those things need to be reported. So workers need to know what they're looking for and who to tell. They also need to know that that supervisor or farm owner, or even if it's a relative, that they're going to take those concerns seriously and really value what that worker is saying. So workers should also be told to never harvest dropped produce. So if you have produce that grows off of the ground and it contacts the ground before or during harvest, that can't be harvested for the fresh market. So workers need to be trained on that. And they also need to be trained to only use clean harvest and packing containers. And they need to know what to do if they find a dirty container or harvest bin or whatever that is.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks. What about visitors? People have you pick, and sometimes they just have occasional groups of people come onto the farm.
And visitors need training too, even though that training might not look the same as when you're training your workers on the farm. You still have to communicate those food safety policies for your farm and those expectations for visitors. And you also must provide access to toilet and hand washing facilities for visitors on your farm. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. So some things you might tell people when they visit their farm is, where can you go? Where can you not go? When should they be washing their hands? So it might be good to post reminders around. The importance of not visiting the farm when they're ill, how to wash your hands, and instructions to keep pets at home. So how you communicate that with your visitors is really up to you. If you have a U-pick with lots of visitors coming through the door every day, signage upon where they check in to get their harvest containers or whatever, that might be where you have those posted and turn visitors' attention there. If you have visitors come in just sparingly, maybe that's something you discuss with them and have them sign off on your visitor policies. Whatever is the best way for your farm is the way that you need to do that.
Okay. So we're going to talk about the routes of contamination, and this is why it's so important to do the training, because a lot of workers just want to do their job, right? They just want to get the harvest done. They want to get it in. They want to get their paycheck, or even if it's a family member, they're probably going to feel the same way. But why this is so important is because the routes of contamination come, I can't tell you what percentage of the foodborne illness comes through workers, but it's a lot. Okay, so Tari, walk us through these different ways that people contribute to contamination in produce.
Sure, there are several different routes that people can introduce contamination into fresh produce, but some things we'll highlight here, feces and the fecal oral route. And what that comes down to is people using the restroom and not washing their hands thoroughly after using the restroom. So that's something you want to drive home with your workers, the importance of hand washing after using the restroom and then after doing other activities too, like eating or drinking, handling animal waste or working with animals. All of those things are things you want to review with your workers. Wearing clean clothing every day at the beginning of every day, and changing clothes when they might become soiled. That's something else you want to review with your workers. I like this slide. I always call him the chicken man, because you think about that man walking through that pen of chickens and all of that waste that could be getting on his clothes and also his footwear. And so those are the things you want your workers to think about, especially if you have livestock on your farm. Hand washing is something I think that cannot be preached enough. We need to constantly drive this home with our workers when they need to wash their hands, and the importance of thorough hand washing with soap and water. Hand sanitizer is not good enough, but we use our hands for so many things. Lots of dirty things. And then also, we also use our hands a lot in the produce industry when we handle produce.
Sure.
So it's really important that hand hygiene is really driven home. I touched on footwear and the opportunities that footwear can offer as far as contamination goes. So workers, depending on their tasks, they might need dedicated sets of footwear. So those are things you want to think about and train your workers on. Tools and equipment can also present contamination risks. So maybe you want to have designated tools and equipment for your farm. That way workers aren't taking knives home. Or maybe they are trained on how to clean their knives at the beginning and end of every day. Those are things your workers should be trained on. And then how to handle illness and injury, not to work when they're sick, or to report any injuries, especially where blood may be present.
Mhm.
Those could present contamination risks for produce.
Great. Thanks so much. The one thing I'd just like to cap up on this slide is that, don't assume that just telling people to wash their hands is enough. Like as a grower, as an operator, you really have to be specific because everyone has their own understanding of what that means. Some people that means don't do it at all, and some people means like surgery, scale, scrub down. So you have to specify, and we'll get into that. Here's some things that are needed for your training programs. And Tari, why don't you walk us through what these are, what you have to have in order to have an adequate training program on your operation?
So what the produce safety rule tells us that we need to cover in training with our workers are principles of food hygiene and food safety. So those would be things like the importance of hand washing, when to wash your hands, not to use the restroom in the field, but to use a toilet facility and wash your hands thoroughly afterwards. So these are just some examples. The Produce Safety Alliance curriculum goes into a lot more detail. So I always encourage growers to really go back there to make sure that you cover all of those topics in the training when it comes to food hygiene and food safety. That's a pretty loaded topic.
Sure.
Um, the next thing they'll want to make sure they cover would be recognizing symptoms of foodborne illness and the importance of personal hygiene for all personnel and visitors. So go over those symptoms with them: diarrhea, fever, jaundice, nausea, vomiting. Go through those symptoms, and workers should know what those are and know that they should report those, and that they should not handle fresh produce when they're exhibiting those symptoms. And those are things you really want to spell out with your workers. And then any other training relevant to the worker's job. That's one of those kind of vague statements that is in the produce safety rule, but you do want to cover any other relevant food safety things with those workers. And don't forget to cover the things we talked about earlier in this video, not harvesting contaminated produce, and not harvesting drop produce, and using clean harvest bins.
Okay, great. Here's some more musts on the training programs.
Some more musts that are listed in the produce safety rule. It has to be or must be appropriate for the job and conducted upon hiring. So before they even start handling produce, they need to go through this training. And then you need to do an annual refresher, at least annual refresher, throughout the season or when a problem arises. So I've worked with growers that they say, I've had the same guys working for me for 30 years, and that's awesome. They should really know those food safety principles and ideas by now. But you still have to do that annual refresher with your workers, no matter how long they've been there, no matter how long they've been doing the task. It's always a good reminder. The training must be easily understood. So if you have workers that maybe English isn't their first language, it has to be that training has to be conducted in that language that they understand. If you have workers where their literacy levels might not be super high, you can't just hand them a book and tell them to read it and go about your day. You have to make sure that they easily understand that training material. It must be supervised by a qualified person, and must include a process for documenting the training, which we will talk about here in a minute. You'll notice in this, in the produce safety rule, it doesn't say you must deliver the training verbally or using a video or anything like that. It's not super prescriptive on how you deliver the training. However you do that is what is best for you and your farm and your workers.
Great. So let's go to the record keeping tips here and how to really do that.
So some things that the one big thing you really have to document for the produce safety rule is your worker training. So you need to keep a record of who was trained, when, who the trainer was, what topics were covered. And then also it needs to be reviewed by a supervisor or the owner or qualified person. So you have to make sure you're keeping those records. You can also keep records for monitoring and restocking of toilet and hand washing facilities, illness and injury reporting, and restocking of first aid kits. Those are all great records to have as well.
Okay, great. And then aren't there some training logs or templates that you guys have that farmers can use?
Yes, Produce Safety Alliance has put together some record keeping templates. I'll make sure we post that link in this video description, but you can see the example of that template on this slide on the right hand side. And that's exactly what you would need. It's just that template right there, and you can tailor that to your farm if you want, or keep it very similar to that.
Great. And so just ending here, I want to remind everyone that there's a really great video that your workers can watch, and we're going to include that in the comments and the links below. But Tari, can you talk a little bit about what that video is?
Yes, that video was released by Cornell a few years ago, and it really goes through those principles of good hygiene and food safety. So it talks about hand washing, proper toilet use, illness and injury reporting, a lot of those things. So a lot of our growers will use that as a great foundation for their training, and that you can have your workers watch that. It needs to be documented, and it's available in English, Spanish, and Creole, so it is available in multiple languages. However, there are a few things that are called out in the produce safety rule that aren't covered in that video. Things like don't harvest anything with animal feces on it, don't harvest dropped produce, some of those things. So really, I encourage growers, if you're going to use that video, make sure you watch it, understand what's in it, and then see how you need to supplement that.
Okay, great. All right, Tari, thanks so much. This was a really good reminder for this really important topic, and check out our other videos and the links in the descriptions. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Tari.